Good Thursday morning to you. As we continue the narrative of Judges, yesterday we talked about Gideon, and today we're going to talk about Gideon's son, Abimelech. Now, if you've been reading along as we've been doing these daily devotionals, in Judges 8, we learned the death of Gideon. You also see that there's a detail about Gideon's life. He has 70 sons. So after Gideon dies, one of his sons, and it's the son of a concubine, goes to his mother's kinsfolk, and so and she is a descendant of Shechem. If you remember the narrative previously, he goes to the kinfolk and he says, "What would you prefer? Would you prefer to have 70 rulers over you, or would you prefer to just have one?" And he really manipulates his mother's kinsfolk. What's fascinating about this story is Abimelech thinks that this is his role to supersede, his role to figure out who should be the next leader. And he's completely missed the point that every leader that the Israelites have had, it has been God who has called the leader. It's been God who's designed it. I'm often reminded of how I get in the way of God's plans. And I don't know if you're like me that way, but sometimes I in my faithfulness, in my prayer life, I think that I'm helping God. And really, I'm just getting in the way of what God has done or what God has planned. Abimelech is doing this, in fact, even further, because I'm not sure how much faith is part of his desire to be king. Remember, we're in a time of judges, but he desires to be king. He manipulates, and he goes to his mother's kinsfolk, and he creates this truce with them, this treaty with them. And then they come back and they attack his brothers. Abimelech is such an evil man in the sight of the Lord that he kills all of his brothers. In fact, what we read in chapter 9, verses 5 and 6, is that he kills all of his brothers on the same stone. He captures them. My guess is he beheads them on the same stone. One brother, Jotham, the youngest of the 70, he escapes. Now, Jotham then in chapter 9, verse 7 on, creates a curse against Abimelech. He talks about a parody, and he talks about the olive trees, the fig trees, and the vine, and then also the brambush. Now, he's making a correlation to the judges that we have thus seen in the history of the Israelites. The brambush, he is referring to Abimelech, to his brother. And he curses the people of Shechem for even creating this treaty, this truce with Abimelech. The interesting thing about this, and it's kind of a footnote for the future, is he goes to Mount Gerizim. Now, when Jesus is encountering the Samaritans, he will have this wonderful interaction with a woman who will say, "You say we should go to Jerusalem to pray on the mountain, but we find holiness in Mount Gerizim." That is the mountain that the Samaritans find God's presence. And that derives much from the story and the curse of Jotham. But that's a lot of generations and a lot of history between this and then. It's just something worth to keep note of for the future. So Abimelech creates this great war. He is trying to assert his authority. He gets a lot of wealth, and he builds this magnificent temple, which really isn't a temple, it's a fortress. Abimelech is in a time with the people where he encourages and even enforces this worship of Baal. Baal is a generic god. And so you would find people carrying multiple insignias of various gods in their pocket, and they would take them out and they would kiss them fervently, and they would create this worship in every moment to Baal, or the worship of many gods. This was Abimelech's goal, is that people would turn from the Lord Almighty and would find themselves creating their own gods that spoke to their own desires. Of course, the end of the story has to exist, that Abimelech is destroyed. And so He has conquered. He has created a fire when all of the enemies are in the tower. His enemies are in the tower. He creates a fire. Over 1,000 men, women, and children are destroyed in the fire. He goes to do this again, and if you go to the end of chapter 9 of Judges, what's really fascinating is there is this woman, Thebez, who is up in the tower, and as she sees Abimelech coming and laying down the brush that has been cut by his own sword to create a fire like he just did in another circumstance, she throws a millstone out of the window, and it crushes his skull. At the end of chapter 9, verse 54 is where this verse takes place. It says, "Immediately he called the young man who carried his armor and said, 'Draw your sword and kill me, so people will not say about me, a woman killed me.' So the young man thrust him through, and he died. When the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they went home. Thus God repaid Abimelech for the crime he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the wickedness of the people of Shechem fall back on their heads, and on them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Gideon." Jerubbaal is the other name for Gideon that ends that chapter. So the people got exactly what they asked for. They wanted a king. They got a king who was ruthless and evil and did nothing in the sight of the Lord. And the king who wanted this wealth and wanted this power and wanted this destruction received exactly what he desired. Only it came back on him in a way that ended his life. I love the footnote. "Do not let them say a woman killed me." I am not weak is what he's saying. I was a great ruler. Abimelech ruled for 3 years. And I just think about and time and just these opportunities that we find in our life of either picking a path of following God or choosing a path of following our own wants and desires. It doesn't matter if it's for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or a couple of years or maybe it's a long time. The reality is there's a certain amount of destruction that comes when we pick a life that is separate from what God desires. When we pick a life that is according to our will and our purpose, when we forget that God's the one who is leading us and directing us, that's when we fall in the danger of being much like Abimelech. How often have we decided to take matters into our own hands? And certainly that's a narrative that happens throughout God's people and the story of Scripture. But it's something that we do in our lives, and maybe we do it so subtly we don't even realize how often we do it. Today, as we think of can you relate, well, hopefully we can't relate to someone who forgoes his family, who kills and destroys just for the sake of his own desires. But maybe we can relate in a slight manner of how often we decide that our wants are more important than someone else's wants. Maybe we can relate when we desire our goals, our ambitions, our views, our way of seeing the world is so much more important than the person next to us or than the community that we're called to exist in. I think there's a lot of great lesson in that revelation, in that relating to, especially if we find ourselves today in such a divided society, in such a contentious environment. I don't think any of us can say anything without someone else yelling at how wrong we are. And that's the reminder that we turn back to God. We speak back into what God has spoken to us. We love one another. We care for each other. We seek God's wisdom and God's direction in all that we do. Hope you have a great Thursday.